January is designated as National Trafficking Awareness Month, as you all know. And I am pleased to have Kate Kimmer with us to discuss the topic. Kate is a crusader against trafficking on a local, national, and international basis, and we are so very fortunate to have her as statewide anti-trafficking coordinator for the Indiana Coalition to End Sexual Assault and Human Trafficking. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I have so many questions for you. Perhaps we can start with a definition. What is human trafficking, and what do our viewers need to know about it?
Sure, thank you. And it's funny because I think a lot of people know of human trafficking and yet do not actually understand what human trafficking is. So under our statute, Indiana statute, which very closely mirrors our federal statute, human trafficking is essentially defined as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a human for the purpose of compelling that individual to engage them in commercial sex, forced marriage, or labor. And they compel those individuals to do that through one of these four means, which are either force, threat of force, fraud, or coercion. Most commonly in trafficking cases, it's usually all of the above. So that's how we define human trafficking under our statute.
I've read statistics that suggest that the business of human trafficking generates more than $150 billion annually worldwide. The U.S. finally criminalized the act of trafficking in 2000. What is being done to address the problem, and by whom?
That is a big question. I would say that that's probably an accurate statistic around just the generated profits that come out of forced labor and forced commercial sex acts. And I mean, it is a global statistic, and there are statistics all over the place. There are folks that'll tell you we likely have 40 million folks who are experiencing trafficking across the globe right now. There are other folks that will tell you we have 2. So 2 million, not 2. But I mean, so it's really all over the place. And what folks are really looking at when they're looking at how we're addressing human trafficking, it's interesting because even when we criminalized human trafficking in the year 2000, the TVPA came out with a 3-pronged approach, which was prevention, protection, and prosecution. So there were specific tools that came out for law enforcement to prosecute this case and to investigate these cases, but we also came out with special protections like the T visa that's specific to survivors of human trafficking that are not born in the United States. And we have things like entire prevention programs looking at vulnerable populations, at-risk youth, and trying to reach them and essentially meet their needs before a trafficker comes along and exploits their vulnerabilities. And so there's a lot being done. About 8 years after the year 2000 and the release of the TVPA, they added a 4th P, which was partnership. And so we've really seen a lot of multidisciplinary teams across the United States come together to holistically address this issue. And the reality is all of these pieces are intricately interconnected. Yes, we need prosecutions. We need to send messages to folks that folks will be held accountable for this crime and that we're taking it seriously. But we need a lot of other things as well. We need prevention programming for our kiddos. We need rights-based awareness raising across industries that we know are especially vulnerable to labor trafficking. We need experts going around and having those conversations with folks that serve in parallel movements like domestic violence and sexual assault. A sexual assault nurse examiner is highly likely to come into contact with an individual who's experiencing trafficking. But what if that nurse doesn't know what those signs look like, right? And even if they did, what if they didn't know where to refer them for services? So as far as what's being done to address this, in the state of Indiana specifically, we've done a lot of work around training first responders, training hospital staff around red flags, training schools and educators around red flags. Those are folks that are likely to come into contact and notice those red flags. Just because you see a red flag, to be totally honest with you, doesn't mean you're going to fix a situation, right? You're not going to swoop in and solve a trafficking situation because you saw a red flag. But if you're a teacher and you have a kid in your class and you're seeing marked behavior changes that you know indicate there's trauma going on in the home, and you reach out and you start getting supportive resources for that kiddo, then there's some investigations, and then that's when we're likely to see a case that actually comes to fruition as far as a criminal prosecution and service services for a trafficking victim. So we all work together to collaborate to address this issue. There's still a lot of work to be done, and I think, I've had this conversation with you before, but I think as a general society, we have a lot of work to do as far as entering out into our communities and treating people with compassion and care and understanding and empathy. And the more that we do that in the world, that just our own worlds that we interact with, the more that we're really tearing down what traffickers tell every person that they traffic, which is nobody will believe you, nobody will ever love you, you won't belong anywhere else, you need me.
So is the business, or perhaps better stated, is the human trafficking industry active in Indiana?
Oh, definitely. Again, as we're talking about folks who are especially vulnerable to this crime, you're looking for folks who are seeking to have a basic need met that any human would need met. So that could be something like safe and stable housing, but that could also be something like a loving home or a sense of belonging or protection, right? And so when we know, for instance, that we have the second highest rate of reported incidents of child abuse and neglect in the United States, then we have to know that there are children across the state whose needs aren't being met, right? When we know that we had an uptick by the thousands as far as documented seasonal farm workers, and nobody's having conversations with very isolated populations about what their rights and resources are and how to access them, and we're seeing visa programs literally wielded against folks who are trying to use them legally, then we're clearly going to have trafficking in those spaces. So a lot of it is really looking at what are these intersections of vulnerability that folks are able to exploit. If we have an opioid epidemic in 30 of our counties, which I think is probably more than 30 of our counties, and you have folks that are desperate to have their addiction needs met, a child can help you meet those needs. And that might sound really horrifying, but that is what we are facing. Over 30% of our cases are familial-based trafficking cases, family trafficking other family members. And you can imagine how incredibly difficult it would be if you were a young person to come forward and say that. How do you even start that conversation? And where do you go even if you do?
So California, Texas, Florida, New York are perhaps recognized as the most heavily trafficked states in the country. On a relative basis, does Indiana have an issue?
I mean, I think it does. I really, truly do. And I think whenever you're looking at a crime that preys on vulnerable folks and really is often, in many cases, a humiliating and stigmatizing experience, it's very difficult for people to come forward about those experiences, right? We know that about sexual assault rates. We know that they're not going to be reported even 25% of the time to law enforcement, right? So the numbers we are working with only reflect the people that we are actively identifying, which also reflects how much training an organization or a first responder has to even recognize those things, because just to reiterate, most folks who experience trafficking do not know that they are victims of trafficking. So that's not how they perceive themselves in that situation. So if we're not identifying that and routing folks into services, then nobody's doing that. So I think when we look at our uptick in reports and we look at our uptick in services and then we look at our uptick in requests for services from those parallel movements, from our homeless shelters, from our DV shelters, then we have to know it's far more prolific than we want to believe it is. And when we have a state, like I said, where our rates are just through the roof as far as sexual violence and violence against our kiddos, you have to imagine that this is a state that's exploiting those vulnerabilities. Of course it is. It's just, that's part of the cycle. It's kind of the perfect storm.
So you've identified some of the issues, ongoing issues being dealt with and by whom in the state. What else needs to be done, in your opinion?
Well, I could probably spend all day talking about what needs to be done. But I have a couple of key points that I'm pretty passionate about. And one is I would really like to see our state legislature put human trafficking as a line item in their budget the same way they do for domestic violence and the same way they do for sexual assault. I think we deserve dedicated resources for that population. I think that We need more dynamic housing opportunities for the folks that I serve. We have very few shelters in the state that can even take human trafficking survivors. Many of those shelters are spread so thin with the populations that are their kind of main populations that they get funded to serve. And the way that those funding streams work is frankly different than what the needs of human trafficking survivors are. And so what we see is them essentially being forced to jump from program to program, shelter to shelter, until they get tired of moving all around and having no real stability and resources, and then end up returning to a really exploitative situation because it's all they know and it's their only option. And that to me is unacceptable. That's just an unacceptable place to be as a state that has a statewide task force that's been running for over 10 years. And for us to not have a real permanent sustainable housing plan for folks that are leaving their abusive situations, that's a problem. How can you find stability and safety and long-term hope and healing without housing? So, I mean, to me, that's a really big one. And then the other one, I'll be frank with you, I feel very passionately about our mental and behavioral health services, and especially when it comes to adults. It is so difficult to find folks that are trauma specialists that really know what they're doing with folks who have survived complex trauma, who are diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder and other dissociative disorders that are so common in complex trauma survivors. It's not fair to ask them to make moves without the appropriate mental supports that they need, and we so rarely have funding for that. And it's just not fair. If you really want to see people thriving, which these folks are incredibly resilient and tough and resourceful and creative, the only thing impeding them from thriving is us. It's our barriers to them accessing school, accessing services, accessing housing, accessing real opportunities. They have the ambition, they have the drive, they're smart, they're gritty. They just need access to those things. So I'm pretty frustrated with that, but we're working on it. And hey, we are creative. The folks that are working hard on this issue in this state are creative and collaborative, and we're doing our best, but I would like some more resources for the folks that I serve.
As the foundation has begun to campaign about this as an issue, a threat to our children, there seems to be some confusion. I've been challenged as to the difference between a prostitute
Mm-hmm.
and an exploited, a trafficked
Mm-hmm.
child or individual.
Mm-hmm.
How would you differentiate the two?
Sure. So, well, when we're talking about children, that's fairly easy, because if you're under the age of 18, in the state of Indiana, under our statute and also under federal statute, if you're under the age of 18 and you're engaged in a commercial sex act, so that's any sex act that's in exchange for anything of value. That could be a safe place to stay tonight, that could be drugs, that could be money, whatever that is, could be a ride to mom's house. Whatever that is, when that occurs and that individual is under the age of 18, they are automatically considered a trafficking victim under our law and federal law. They cannot be charged with prostitution. We do not believe that children are able to consent to commercial sex. If they have basic needs that need to be met, we need to be meeting them in a healthy way, and understanding that we should probably be making them a ward of the state until we can get those services in place. So as far as that literal legal definition goes, there is no such thing as a child prostitute in the state of Indiana or under our federal definition. Do people still use that term? Yes. Do people purchase sex from children all the time? Yes. Right, we just saw the Franklin College president get in trouble for soliciting a minor intentionally, and I find that, frankly, that's not uncommon. I think a lot of times we think we don't know buyers of sex. You know buyers of sex. I guarantee you know buyers of sex. I know buyers of sex. And I think a lot of times we think that those folks aren't buying from teens and children, and frankly, they often are, and that's exactly what they're often looking for. So all of that to say, there is a big difference there as far as our kiddos go. And then when adults are concerned, right, prostitution is a crime. And prostitution in the state of Indiana would be two consenting adults engaging in a commercial sex act. And that is not allowed, that is illegal, right? But when you are talking about a commercial sex act where there's a third party involved, there's a third party facilitator who's inducing that commercial sex act through force, threat of force, fraud, or coercion, we're talking about trafficking. And just because somebody isn't in literal locks and chains in that moment does not mean that they are free to leave that situation. Traffickers know folks' vulnerabilities, they know how to exploit those vulnerabilities, they know what threats to make. A lot of times for the folks that I serve, it's not a threat to themselves, it's a threat to somebody they love, right? If you don't do this for me, that's fine, I'll go pick your sister up. If you don't do this for me, that's fine, I know where your mom works. So a lot of times we see the survivors that we're serving protecting everybody around them and taking all of the physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. To protect other people. It's kind of a dark world I live in.
So you've described a number of public and private groups actively working to assist individuals in escaping the industry. Mm-hmm. Can you describe the survivors and what happens to them as a result of these efforts to bring them out of the industry, so to speak?
So it really depends. There's such a stark difference in what it looks like for kiddos and what it looks like for adults, right? So for adults, just like with anything else, like if we were talking about sexual assault or domestic violence, that has to be a choice that they make, right? It can't be a choice that we make for them. Otherwise, we're doing exactly what their trafficker did, right? I know what you need to do, how you need to do it, when you need to do it, and I'm going to tell you how to do it. That's not a very empowering experience. It doesn't really help you change your mindset about how to live in a different culture and world. So when folks are leaving the industry, that really happens successfully in the context of meaningful relationships. Folks need healthy attachments, healthy humans, healthy community, right? Just like anybody does. And that's the support that you need to get through it. And a lot of times there's a tremendous amount of grief in leaving that life and leaving folks in that life. And I think a lot of times people really want to simplify everything and say, that was violent, that was abusive, aren't you so lucky now? But there were pieces of it that maybe somebody they loved or maybe some memory of protection or whatever it is. And so you have to be able to be in that space with folks and help them grieve what's worth grieving and let go of what's worth letting go. And then when you're looking forward, you know, you tend to have a tremendous amount of barriers that they're going to face just for basic successes. A lot of times folks that I serve do have criminal backgrounds. A lot of times they have picked up a substance abuse disorder as a way to cope through all of their trauma. A lot of times they haven't had a job ever or haven't had a straight job in so many years that they have really no resume to submit somewhere. Who's going to give them a letter of recommendation, right? Who's going to be there just all of these basic things that we take for granted when you come from healthy community and you know what healthy relationships look like and mentorship looks like. It's really difficult because that's the reality is you're asking them to leave abuse, but you're also asking them to leave everything they know and everyone they know and do something completely different, and that takes a tremendous amount of support. And I really appreciate Stephanie Jeffers, the founder of Grit into Grace, recently posted about an individual that Grit into Grace has been serving for almost a year, and Grit into Grace is basically no barrier. We call ourselves low barrier, but basically no barrier, which means that we serve folks really where they're at. And if they're still in active drug use, we serve them. If they're still actively engaged in commercial sex, we serve them. That doesn't stop us from serving folks. And that's exactly where you find folks getting what they need to make the decisions to make themselves safe. And so watching this individual over the course of a year go from I won't even sit at your table to I'm making a choice to check myself into a recovery program was pretty incredible to watch. And that individual would definitely tell you that was because of relationship and community. Otherwise, what was the point in making the change, right? Life is so lonely. Life is honestly, in many cases, it feels like it's not worth living, right? So to have something worth living for and something to be excited about and folks to support you, it's pretty special, pretty cool thing to be a part of. So it's complicated is the short answer to what it looks like. As far as our kiddos go, we have mandates as a state to protect our children, right? And the Department of Child Services does have a special child in need of services, or CHINS, specific to this population. They can CHINS kiddos regardless of their relationship to their trafficker, which means they don't have to be parent or guardian in order for DCS to come in, CHINS, and say, we're going to compel you into some services. We do have specialized residential facilities for that, not enough. We do have specialized residential programs for that, not enough. We do have some of the best clinical therapists in this state. We have some incredible clinical therapists for this population that are certified in every letter after their name you can think of as far as working with folks with complex trauma. So we are watching those cycles of violence be transformed. But we need foster families. There's just still so much that we need. It's exciting to see our wins, and we do have a lot of wins, but I carry home every day all of the people that I didn't get a win for that day. So that's a lot more people than the wins, unfortunately, right now.
Absolutely. So as a measuring stick, the federal government claims to have spent $31 million last year, 2018, to assist survivors. Double what they'd spent in 2017. I don't know if that's enlightenment or otherwise, but how much needs to be spent to really make a dent in this process?
Well, realistically, in this state, I would say we need several million right now. If we're just even looking at one of the grants that the federal government just released through OVC is a $500,000 grant for rental assistance. But even when we broke that down and budgeted that out, that meant that we would only be able to help 28 people. Right, and wait, what? 28 people, $500,000. I got a lot more than 28 people who need rental assistance for this population, and that's just for Indianapolis, right? The whole state. So when you're really thinking about that now, at the end of the day, the truth is it ends up costing us a lot less, because if folks keep getting incarcerated, if folks keep overdosing, if folks keep ending up in the hospitals, that costs us money as a society. To be honest with you, I don't care about that. That's not why I do what I do. But if you do care about the economics of that as a society, as a taxpayer, you're paying for that. Wouldn't you rather pay for them to get out of a cycle of violence and transform intergenerational cycles of violence in our communities? I would. I would rather invest in that. And we see those programs that are really holistic, that are really empowerment-based, that are rights-based, that are looking at the economic piece, the physical piece, the psychological piece, the relational piece. We see incredible successes. And as I mentioned, if you can survive what these folks have survived, you're a tremendous human. And what you can accomplish when you don't have all those barriers is incredible. So we're really missing out on tapping into some of our most incredible resources across the state, which are these individual survivors and their unique ability to navigate systems and violence, and maintain creativity and dynamism and all of that. But I'm kind of obsessed with
yeah,
that.
no, absolutely. How would we support then the survivors, and what can the general public do about this? And again, there are lots of private charities, foundations, churches, groups that are helping where they can.
Absolutely.
What else can be done, or what else do you think needs to be done to promote this effort to the general public?
I would say, I'm really excited that the IPATH Task Force is going to be releasing our guidebook here in the next couple months. And we will, in that guidebook, be talking about basically evidence-based best practices and the programs in the state that are utilizing them. And I hope the public utilizes that as an opportunity to think critically about where they're sending their dollars to. We have organizations that deserve your money and fiscal support. We have organizations that deserve your volunteer time and those types of treasures that you can give, whether that's helping with a website or whatever it is, or connecting an individual with a business mentor that would help them with their first job. So there's a tremendous amount of spaces and places that you can really get connected in. Unfortunately, in my field, because it is an emerging field and we've only been an official field since the TVPA was released in 2000, we're still really navigating how it is that we professionalize, and that we essentially, pretty much right now any mom and pop can just stand up and say, I have an HT org. and there's no like credentialing from the state for that, unless they're working with children, that's different, right? But if you're working with adults, you can pretty much say you do whatever, and if you don't get government dollars for that, you can pretty much do whatever as long as it's not literally illegal, right? So all of that to say, I really am hoping that folks kind of concentrate their resources, whether that's their time, their network connections, or their money, to the orgs that are doing the best work in the state. They deserve those resources, and our folks deserve those healthy connections. And there are organizations, if you're interested in mentoring a young person or an adult, just one person, you don't have to have a whole caseload like me, you, I think, would be amazed at what they'll teach you, to be frank, and how you can serve them. It's a pretty cool symbiotic relationship. So there really are a lot of ways to get plugged in. And I definitely encourage folks, I actually brought Katie's book with me, I encourage folks to read more closely about human trafficking and the way we're addressing this issue across the United States. Katie's story, this is an autobiography, they were a familial-based trafficking survivor, and I think one of the most powerful pieces of the story, as Katie shares it, you realize that Katie did tell people. They told a lot of people, and nobody wanted to listen. And you realize, oh my God, how many little kids out there are telling somebody that this is what's happening, and nobody believes them, or everybody tells them to be quiet because it's an issue they don't want to think about. So I really encourage folks to be intentional about what they're taking in as far as media and myths. There's a lot of that. I mean, it doesn't look like taken, y'all. So just be really intentional about that and educating themselves, and share that information with others. And I know it sounds really small, but it's really not small. It really is a game changer, and I can tell you story after story of people's lives that have been changed by this. But take time to be kind and compassionate to other people. And when your kiddos are perhaps hanging out with a kid that you feel like, maybe that kid isn't the best influence, bring that kid into your home and you be a good influence for that kid. That kid needs somebody. That kid doesn't need to be isolated from your kid. I'm not saying that you should let your kid go do stuff that's high risk or dangerous, but seriously, invest in our youth. Invest in the youth that are directly connected to you, that are in your church, that are in your kids' school, that are in your kids' youth group. Invest in those kids. Have meaningful conversations with those kids. Talk to those kids about being a safe person. When I go into groups with youth and I do my presentation, I have one specific for youth, I have at least one kid every single time disclose sexual violence. Every single time. Because they'd never before felt like that was something I could just say. So we really have got to be making that space for our kids, or our kids are going to end up harming people because they don't know any different.
To my greatest fear, it's estimated, and you can comment on this if you wouldn't mind, but 300,000 U.S. children under the age of 18 are lured into the industry on an annual basis. This is a shocking statistic to me. Is that number possibly accurate?
I think it's a lot higher. The only reason why I'm saying that is because they just did a really comprehensive case study in Texas on human trafficking, and their numbers were coming up. Now, it wasn't just youth, it was adults as well, but their numbers were coming up at 300 to 350,000 folks experiencing trafficking in the state of Texas. So if that's even remotely accurate, there's no way that 300,000 across the United States is accurate. And if we're looking at forced marriage, we're looking at sex trafficking, and we're looking at labor trafficking, and we're talking about our kids, it has to be higher than that. There's no way it's not higher than that.
Okay, on a census-adjusted basis, just to bring this into perspective, that means every year, 5,000 Indiana kids are being lured into the industry. How does this happen?
Well, I think there's a lot of answers to that question, because the trafficking takes so many different forms, right? And so Whether we're talking about our inner city, or we're talking about Hamilton County, or we're talking about a rural county, trafficking is going to look different in those spaces and places. We're still talking about an individual who's being compelled to do something they don't want to do, that's exploitative, that makes money for somebody, right? That force, fraud, coercion, we're talking about that. But you can imagine how that looks in Montgomery County. It's going to be different than how that looks in Marion County. There's not any less vulnerable people per capita in those counties than in Marion County, right? So what we see in those types of counties might look different, but we're still seeing those heightened levels of exploitation. And I won't name the county, but several years ago I went into a county and I was speaking with the sheriff and the chief of police about human trafficking. They were absolutely convinced that was not in their county. It's a rural county in Indiana. That's not a problem here. And I said, really? Let's talk about your opioid epidemic. It's like when you drive into this county, there's just billboard after billboard about heroin and opioids and all, and death. There's literal coffins on the billboards. It's kind of dark. And so we talk a little bit about that, and I said, so how do you think some folks are meeting those needs? And as we get to talking about that, by the end of our conversation, they're like, oh, I know those kids. Oh, the kids that go to the strip club in the bigger city, 30 minutes away, they're like 14 from that trailer park. Oh, yeah, I know those kids. That's trafficking? Yeah, that's trafficking.
By any other definition.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think that when we talk about how does this happen, I mean, the truth is this has been happening since humans have existed. Humans have exploited, abused, and enslaved and sexually assaulted other humans. That's part of a really sick reality of our human history. And when you start to look at those intergenerational moves and you start to mix that in with desperate needs, whatever those are, you can imagine how prolific it is across all these different levels of society. And in a lot of spaces and places in like Hamilton County, for instance, I know folks they get worked up, they think it doesn't happen here. It does. True Harbor is a residential facility in the state of Indiana that solely serves girls that have been trafficked or exploited, and more than half of their caseload is from Hamilton County. So it does happen here. Now, are those kids probably economically desperate? No, probably not. But what else was going on at home? Was there abuse at home, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse? Was there neglect at home, right? What was going on that caused somebody to look for love, belonging, whatever it is, in all the wrong places, right? And what made them believe that if they turned around and told those folks, the people who are supposed to care for you, that this is what was going on, that they would be blamed, right? So, I mean, I do think that 5,000 is probably fairly accurate, but I do think it looks different. That doesn't mean that that's the kid that's going to a motel with a street-based pimp in a rough neighborhood in Indianapolis. It could be the kid whose dad is a judge and uses that kid and passes them around because that judge also likes access to other people's kids. I mean, that's an actual story of a survivor I've served, right? And so as far as how those different types of trafficking occur and how they look, I mean, it really is, it's incredibly sad. And this morning when I was on the radio, my BSW practicum student was with me, and he's also a survivor leader, and he's a male human trafficking survivor. And as far as sex trafficking goes, that's fairly unusual for them to be open about their trafficking. It's not unusual for men to experience trafficking. It's unusual for them to be open about it. And he talks a lot about that. Really what called him to be open about it was that as a youth, when he was going through everything he was going through, he wished he knew one person who had been through it too. And it's really important for him that other boys and men know that it's okay to come forward and talk about this. And I think especially when those boys and men identify as straight, it's especially difficult for them to come forward and talk about it. They feel emasculated. They feel like somehow they did something wrong. They didn't do anything wrong. You can't do anything to deserve that type of harm.
So closer to home, you're very familiar with the document published by the State Attorney General's office in 2016 that identified Carmel as the number 2 traffic city in the state. Carmel, one of the safest cities in America, is the second most trafficked city in the state of Indiana. So how do we protect our kids and our grandkids?
You know, The truth is, I think that there's actually a lot of ways to protect your kids and your grandkids from experiencing trafficking. And I think that they really start at looking at, again, go back to below the surface, right? So what's going on in the situation? And the reason why I say that is, first of all, most kids don't feel comfortable to talk about drugs, sex, and a lot of things, right, with their parents. You need to be able to talk to your parents about those things. You need a safe person to ask questions to. I'm sorry if that makes you uncomfortable, but that's the reality, right? So what we have is these kids that are hiding one thing after another thing after another thing. So, ways to help protect and prevent trafficking among our youth in Carmel. One really important key point, I really cannot stress this enough, is open and honest conversations with your kids and reminding them that you are a safe place. They can come talk to you. You want them to come talk to you. You want them to be safe. You understand sometimes folks do risky things, but most and foremost, you want them to be safe. Please know that your children are likely engaging in sending and posting nude photos. I wish that wasn't true, but it probably is. And I am very grateful every day that I graduated long before social media existed, or I just don't know if I could have stayed out of trouble. But anyhow, I did. And our kids today, they don't have that, right? And so there's all of these different accounts that kids can get on and meet people that are safe and unsafe and everything in between. You will never keep up with all of that. You can try. You will not. There are always new apps coming out. Kids are ebbing and flowing. They've got their Finsta. They got their actual Instagram. They got their one. I mean, I don't want to give kids too many ideas if they don't already have them. But anyways, there are lots of apps. There are calculator apps to hide your photos on and put in a code, and then it pops out your photos instead of an actual calculator, right? So I really have to go back full circle, stress one more time. Open and honest conversations with your kids are really important, right? So instead of trying to attempt to stop them from doing things that they are likely going to do, it's better to say, if you do those things, can you just come talk to me, because I just really want you to be safe. And talking about what we would call in the adult world harm reduction strategies. So, hey, if you are going to be posting about whatever, can you please not post like your school in the background? People don't need to know what school you go to, right? Or people that might seem small, but for folks that are perpetrating on our kiddos, in like 3 seconds on your kid's Instagram, they can know what school they go to, what sports they play. They can go look up at what time they're going to be there, right? And I'm not saying, a lot of times in trafficking situations, they do already know your kids. They are people that are already in your kids' lives, whether they're teachers or coaches or whatever it is. But again, that circles back to, if you've already had those conversations with your kids that I will believe you and I am here and you can come talk to me about those things, that's when kids are going to come forward and tell you what's going on. You think the teacher didn't tell them that nobody will believe you? They'll think you're this type of kid, right? And I'm going to say that this is what happened and everybody will believe me because I've been a teacher for 20 years or whatever it is. So that's really important. I think it's really, really important to talk to our kids about consent and sexual violence. We have really heightened rates of sexual violence in the state of Indiana. I think we have second or third highest in the nation. And so I think it's really important that we start having those conversations a lot younger. I think one of the most incredibly tragic things that I've experienced is we have folks that do go into our schools that are open to the conversation and talk about sexual violence and consent. And what we normally find in our high schools is that kids are coming forward and saying, oh my God, I've perpetrated sexual violence and I didn't realize that that's what I did. What do I do to have accountability for that harm? Oh my God, what on earth am I even saying right now? How are we at a point where our kiddos don't even know how to not perpetrate against one another? Oh my God. So for us to be thinking that somehow we're protecting our children when there's the internet, you're not protecting them. The internet is there. So you've got to have those conversations, and they are uncomfortable, and there are plenty of organizations that would be willing to help you have those conversations with your kids, that would be willing to help and step up and, provide different types of mentorship and relationship to kids, but I think that's really important. And I think that if we aren't meeting those basic needs for our kids and we aren't having those conversations about violence, there's no way for them to meaningfully avoid it. They won't even know what those red flags look like until it's way too late. It doesn't need to be too late. So much of this can be prevented.
Can you expound on those allies that parents can seek out that can help them strategize?
Sure. I mean, I think,
around these things?
really one of the best programs that does serve Marion County primarily is Purchased. They actually have a program for parents and families, not just for kiddos. But I think really any program in your area, one of your youth serving bureaus, any folks that focus on youth mentorship, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Boys and Girls Club, those are organizations that want to help you navigate those conversations with kids. They want to help keep kids safe. We have places like Chauncey's Place right here in Hamilton County that teach about sexual violence and healthy boundaries and safe people, and right. So there are a ton of opportunities for us to be getting that support and having those conversations. Really just depends on where you are as far as who your local person is, but that's who I would suggest.
Are the schools doing enough, in your opinion?
No.
We'll leave it at that.
It's not, listen, wait, I feel like I gotta expound on that and just say, my mother is a teacher, my father was an educator. I feel very strongly about our schools. I know that our schools are underpaid and overworked. But I do know that most of our kids are gonna be in school, and I really think that we need to have, and I'm gonna say it, I think we need to have comprehensive, anatomically correct sex education that includes a conversation about healthy boundaries, violence, and reporting. Our kids deserve to have that information. People are harming them and they don't know where to go.
Okay.
I know I'm not a good time. It's pretty depressing.
Let's change the focus of the conversation now to something we haven't spoken greatly about yet. I'm a businessman.
Mm-hmm.
Recognize in order to have a profitable business, you have to have a product and a buyer.
Mm-hmm.
The old supply and demand equation.
Mm-hmm.
Are we in the state of Indiana dealing with both sides of that equation effectively? And I'm talking about buyers.
No. It's the short answer to that. Really just in the past year and a half or so, as multidisciplinary professionals, have we even meaningfully started to engage this conversation. So the task force did have a new group founded, the Anti-Demand Working Group. It's primarily comprised of advocates, law enforcement, and prosecutors, looking at ways to address demand in meaningful ways, comparing to other states and things that have worked. I think it's really, really important for us to remember when it comes to demand, this is a painful reality, but for a lot of the folks that we serve, the victims are going to get arrested and the purchasers are going to go home to their families. And all of our evidence base from across the United States tells us that the most common folks to purchase sex are going to be white-collar folks, white males who are married and have families. And they are often purchasing sex from children that are literally the same age as their children. How that is okay, how they're processing in their brain that that's an acceptable thing to do to this 15-year-old, but then they have their precious baby 15-year-old that they can't imagine even going on a date. I don't know. I don't understand that disconnect. But I do know that it is an issue. I know that in Muncie, they created a fake ad that was intentionally created to look like an ad for an underage girl. And they had hundreds of hits for that ad and offers for that ad within a day. So we know that there's a demand for this, a pretty steep demand for this product as far as humans go. So there really is a tremendous amount of work to be done there. And to be frank with you, yes, women purchase sex, but mostly men are the ones purchasing sex, and I'm not seeing a lot of males take a leadership role in having that conversation, whether it's with their men's groups or even like at their country club or the YMCA. There's a lot of opportunities where men are doing things with other men, and they're not usually having conversations about preventing sexual violence, right? So I'm just keeping it real. I'm pretty sure that's not what they mean by locker room talk. So there's a lot. I think that is a space specifically for men to be having more meaningful conversations with one another, honestly. And again, I know this sounds really uncomfortable because I think most people don't talk about what I talk about every day. But if folks are purchasing and we have a demand driving children being sold for sex in our state, I think it's probably worth being uncomfortable and having a conversation with your friends. And it might even start really simply like a conversation about strip clubs. And then you have a conversation that's a little bit deeper than that. So that's what I have to say about demand. We do have some exciting opportunities coming this coming year with that committee, and looking at holding folks accountable for the harm that they've caused, but also helping them.
We've covered a lot of topics here.
We have.
Wrapped into this issue of human trafficking. What have I not asked you that you'd like to speak to at this point in time in terms of summarizing the fight we have ahead of us?
So in summary, I would say it is an issue here in Indiana. It is more prolific than you believe it is. You have met a human trafficking survivor, whether you knew that or not. And I would say that we have a long road ahead of us, but I would really appreciate people staying positive and optimistic and encouraged, because folks are fighting really hard. And the folks that we're fighting for are worth every iota of that energy. And I frankly feel tremendously blessed to have the opportunity to work in a field that I get to be an active participant in transforming cycles of violence, dismantling systems of oppression, and loving on kind of the coolest people ever. So, I mean, really in closing, I hope that folks don't get kind of overwhelmed, because even though the numbers are staggering and the severity of the issue can feel overwhelming, any single one person that gets to leave their situation with the testimony of living the life they've always wanted to live or didn't even know that they wanted to live is worth the energy, is worth the resources, is worth us to keep pushing. So don't get overwhelmed by hundreds of thousands. Remember that every single one of those people have a name and a story and a dream, and they're worth it.
So Kate, how about contact information for people who will see this that want to reach out, address question to you or to the coalition? How about contact information?
Sure.
How can they go about that?
You're welcome to reach out to me, which is just Kate, K-A-T-E, at Indiana, INDIANA, CESA.org, IndianaKESA.org. You can also check out the IPATH Task Force and Indiana Coalition to End Sexual Assault and Human Trafficking website at IndianaKESA.org, INDIANACSA.org. And there's a lot of cool resources on our website. There's webinars on there, there's tons of links to peer-reviewed articles, there's information on joining the task force committees. If you're interested in an organization that we partner with closely that does incredible work in your county or city or neighborhood, we would love to talk to you about that and connect you with them. So please do reach out. I hope folks do reach out.
Thanks for your service.
Thank you.
And thanks for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good luck.